One of the most challenging areas of comic book collecting are romance comic books. And why is this? Well, it's kind of understandable. On the most part, comic book collectors are predominantly male, and if you look at what are popular genres for comic book collecting, like specifically males, it's like superhero, it can also be like science fiction or horror. And romance titles are kind of like off the radar for a lot of comic book collectors. And because of that, a lot of them just haven't survived over the years. That being said, there certainly is interest in romance comic books, and I want to say it's kind of been a slowly growing interest. And a lot of that is driven by covers. And specifically, if you look at older comic books from the late 40s and early 50s, kind of the golden age of romance comic books, there are a lot of wonderful covers done by a lot of amazing artists. I'll talk a little bit more about that later in this video. But I kind of wanted to do a deeper dive into romance, the history of romance comic books, as well as show you some examples that I've picked up over the years in my collection. This is a copy of Boy Meets Girl, and this is an example of an earlier romance title. It's published by Gleason, and a couple interesting things to note. You'll notice over here it says, not intended for children. So these are stories that were certainly more geared towards younger adults who did read a lot of comic books at that time. Another thing that's kind of interesting is that, this says conforms to the Comics Code, but this was a different Comics Code that, predated what would become like the Comics Code Authority in 1955. And this was a code that was established by a number of different publishers, but not all the publishers joined in and used it. It's supposed to be kind of like a stamp to kind of symbol that, these are, wholesome comic books. It didn't really, what I would say, like make much of a difference in terms of what was published inside the comic books at that time. Lev Gleason published a number of romance titles, and Boy Meets Girl is one of them. And this is kind of an interesting cover as well too, because it almost has kind of like a painted effect. It's like a pseudo gray tone cover at that time. This is also another Lev Gleason romance title, and it's called Lover's Lane. And a lot of romance titles earlier on were using photo covers. Certainly in the early years, many of the publishers used photo covers. And this one certainly looks like a photo that was taken well before this time. I could be wrong. The titles used, I was no angel, I had a confession to make to the man I was going to marry, and I was scared to death, really tried to kind of capture the attention of people looking on the newsstands. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the history of romance comic books. The first romance comic book came out in 1947, and it was produced by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, and it was called Young Romance. And it hit at a perfect time. And the reason why was because, well, comic books at that point had been around for 10 to 15 years. It had become, evolving as a medium. And not only that, it was a very popular form of entertainment. And, predominantly there were a lot of superheroes, funny animal titles, but certainly, the younger adults, the teens, were craving other types of genres, beyond the ones that were popular at that time. And with Joe Simon and Jack Kirby, they thought that, okay, let's give romance a shot. And their first issue was a massive success. Apparently it sold, maybe 1 million copies, but even more amazing was that the sell-through rate of that first issue was above 90%. So, typically when a comic book is put on the stands, any remaindered copies get returned to the publisher or distributor to be considered like a success. If you sold more than 50% of your copies, that's pretty good. But 92% is just extremely unusual. So they knew they had a hit on their hands. And what happened was, pretty predictable. Other publishers saw the immediate success of this romance title, and then they decided to publish their own. So they're literally overnight, like in a span of like a year, dozens of romance titles started to flood the newsstands. Another publisher that would publish a lot of romance titles is Fawcett, and this is a copy of Sweetheart Diary number 13. And like many other romance titles earlier on, they were using photo covers. And while some collectors really do not like photo covers, I don't mind them so much. They certainly kind of capture the feel of that time and that era. Fawcett romances are also, pretty tough to locate in any kind of grade. But the nice thing about like romance titles, if you're interested in them, is that they are still what I would say are fairly cheap. You can usually find them for under $20, and if you're okay with like a lesser grade, then they can even be cheaper. This is a copy of Cowgirl Romances number 12, published by Fiction House, and Fiction House is well known for their covers, specifically from like Planet Comics or Jungle or Wings, or a lot of their titles had spectacular covers for their time. This one's an interesting one just because you have this, cowboy down here in the corner seducing this woman, and it's a very provocative position that they're in. Yeah, an interesting title, like Cowgirl Romances. I want to say it's almost kind of like a cult collected title just because of the name of the title itself. And this particular issue as well, too, just because of the position of the different characters on the cover. Quite an interesting title, pretty tough to locate in any kind of shape. Cowgirl Romances number 12. At this time, the late 40s, there weren't many other different forms of entertainment. And certainly, if you were to look at the reading kind of peak of comic books, this would be the time. It wasn't atypical where newsstand sales of comic books would exceed 50 million copies a month. And that is a number that is completely unheard of like these days. So, if there were so many romance titles that were published and so many millions sold, why are they so hard to find these days? And the reason is pretty simple. Comic books back then were a disposable form of entertainment. You read your comic book and then you threw it in the trash. Certainly some people would keep some of the issues, but by and large, they were kind of like, newspapers or other forms of just kind of information or entertainment, magazines and such. Most people just read them and then discarded them. And comic book collecting really only became a popular hobby, like I would say kind of in the 1960s. And when you look at most comic book collectors even back then, again, they were mostly male. And so even though female readership at this time was very high, well, girls and women, like, just by and large, didn't keep as many comic books around. This is the earliest copy of Young Romance that I have, and this is volume 12, number 5, and you can actually even see over here it has the date, which is August-September 1959. A lot of the early issues were done by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. At this point, I believe later on, not so much. And you can see the bigger stamp of the Approved by Comics Code Authority in the top right corner. Young Romance is the initial flagship title for Prize and was one of the biggest sellers during their time. Young Romance would later be purchased by DC and continued for quite a while, right until like the 1970s. Romance comic books can kind of be divided into two eras. You have what I would say the pre-code era, or maybe the golden age of romance comic books that occurred between 1947 to 1954, and then your post-code era, which was 1955 and after. And what you saw with many comic books after 1955, there was a pretty steep decline. What the Comics Code Authority, the Senate investigations, the negative publicity that comic books were receiving, comic books just took a really big hit. And these kind of new restrictions kind of also made comic books a bit watered down in terms of their content. And romance was no exception. There were certainly a lot of areas that romance could kind of explore before 1955, things changed a lot. So you could no longer have like mentions of like, even like affairs, divorce, like suicide, like all of these subjects were all of a sudden taken off the table. So they kind of had to change their format. And I think as a result, interest in romance comic books, while, it was still there, certainly went on decline. That being said, after 1955, there were still quite a few romance comic books there. Some other genres, like crime, as an instance, literally disappeared overnight, and even like horror took quite a step back in terms of the numbers that were published, pre-code versus post-code. I kind of want to show an example of what a pre-code cover would look, and then a post-code. This is a pre-code romance title, and you can see that the artwork is certainly different than what would happen in later issues. So from issue number 31 to issue number 37, and this is a far more, how would I say, less dramatic, less suggestive cover. And here you just have a cheerleader with her boyfriend in the background. High School Romance, a Harvey title. They published a number of other different romance titles, a few which I'll be showing shortly. I've mentioned that old romance comic books can be hard to find in any condition or like in high grade. Well, there is one exception to this, and that's Harvey Comics. So Harvey Comics published a lot of romance titles in the late 40s, early 50s, but what Harvey did was they actually stored a lot of their extra copies at their warehouse. And Harvey is kind of better known for like its Richie Rich Casper titles, but what happened in 1980, Harvey was kind of going into a decline, but what they wanted to do was kind of reboot their comic book production, their titles, and what they did was they sold off the contents of their warehouse to kind of raise money as well as pay off debts. And inside this warehouse apparently were comic books that went back as far as 1939, and in some cases with some of these issues, they had like more than 100 copies of a particular issue of many of their titles. So a lot of these comic books were in great condition, with the exception of being page quality. The environment that the comic books were in this warehouse was probably not great, so it's probably pretty warm, humid, so the page quality of a lot of these Harvey comic books are not great. But I have some of these, and let's take a look at some of them. This is an early issue of High School Romance, and this is issue number 2. And as I mentioned, earlier romance comic books often had photo covers, and this is an example of a perky teenager from that time. Some of the titles of the stories I find are really kind of funny. I Had to Share My Boyfriend, Love Isn't Funny, and My Phantom Lover. Often what's popular with collectors are titles or comic covers that have these kind of double entendre meanings in their covers, especially with Archie titles that have some pretty notorious ones and are highly sought after by collectors. So High School Romance would change from photo to your standard comic line art, but I find like some of these kind of old-fashioned covers kind of humorous, especially some of the titles like this one, which is Read Backstairs Love. What could that possibly mean? This is a copy of High School Romance number 28. And a lot of these pre-code romance covers would often have like, a couple embracing and then either a woman or a man in the background looking upon and seeing that they've been double-crossed. So yeah, it's a very common trope for these romance covers. She thought no man could resist her, and she set out to prove it. Read, too easy to love. So I mentioned that the popularity of older romance comic books is predominantly driven by covers. And, this kind of applies across the board with other genres, especially horror or crime. And I think that's a bit too bad, because a lot of these older romance comic books, especially pre-code romance comic books, can be kind of interesting and fun to read. It really certainly gives you a snapshot of what kind of life was like in the U.S. during that time, especially when it came to kind of like dating and relationships. If there's one standout publisher that I should mention, it's St. John Publishing, and the reason why is because they employed Matt Baker, who was just an incredible artist in his own right, and a lot of his covers are extremely highly sought after. And this has kind of always been the case with collectors. You talk with collectors who like collecting Golden Age comic books, specifically what they call like good girl art, and Matt Baker's name is always mentioned. And a lot of his better covers from the Golden Age sell for a lot of money, like thousands of dollars, and for good reason, because a lot of his covers are really amazing. He really knew how to draw women very well. One well-known artist from the late 40s, early 50s is Lee Elias, and he's certainly better known for his horror titles, his horror covers, specifically Chamber of Chills, that have just a few spectacular covers that are very popular with collectors. Love, Problems, and Advice, this is an early issue, number 4. I just wanted to show you basically how he developed as an artist. Here you can see his earlier artwork, and then this is issue number 10 of Love, Problems, and Advice Illustrated. You can certainly see his art styles developed. It's becoming heavier lines, and just there's a richer feel to them. And then you can see a jump in the quality of his artwork with First Love number 41. And this, to me, I feel like is when he's kind of at his peak. I want to show you one more, and that's First Love number 44. As he matured as an artist, his work just got better and better. So Lee Elias, an artist that I feel certainly is kind of underrated in the romance area, that's often dominated by like Matt Baker, Jack Kamen, Jack Kirby. Certainly worth looking for if you're looking at collecting romance. And again, like these Harvey books can generally be found fairly inexpensive. If I can mention one trade paperback of a romance comic book, it's Young Romance that was published by Fantagraphics Books, edited by Michel Gagnier, who's also a fellow Canadian. And he does a great job of breaking down the kind of different eras, as well as selecting a few really good stories to kind of sample from the different eras. And I highly recommend it if you can find it. There are also a few good kind of articles in there where he goes into more detail about the history of romance comic books. Certainly worth looking out for and checking out. This is a copy of My Love Story number 1. This is an Atlas romance, and Atlas romance titles are very, very hard to find. This is a postcode issue. You can see by this giant approved by the Comics Code Authority stamp on it. If you're looking at, exploring underappreciated romance titles, Atlas is where to look. But at the same time, Atlas romance books are very hard to find, but there are some incredibly amazing covers that were published by Atlas during their time. This is the only true Atlas romance book that I have, and I bought this decades ago. Very hard to find, and certainly worth seeking out if you're looking at collecting romance titles. This was kind of an interesting video to make. I wasn't really sure how to go about doing it, and if a lot of people like this video and watch it, I'll probably do another one, because there is a lot to unpack when it comes to romance comic books. If you like this video, here's another one that you can check out over here. And until next time, read and enjoy your comic books.